The first thing I noticed wasn't the argument outside the door, but the faint, rogue Bluetooth handshake pinging from the hallway, trying to pair with the encrypted router I had installed in Bose's living room. I was hunched over a gaming PC, fingers deep inside its guts, piecing it together for my best friend, Joe. The smell of stale pizza and the constant hum of the cooling fans filled the room as I traced the connections, making sure everything was running perfectly. My sniffer tool picked up an aggressive connection attempt, a messy, loud burst of code that stood out like a sore thumb. That wasn't normal. I glanced at my monitor, and the signal strength spiked red. Someone was close, too close. I didn't move. I listened harder, the sharp words that followed piercing the air. "You think you can just ghost me, Joe, after everything we've been through?" The voice was nasally, laced with desperation, and I immediately recognized it, Darian Hill. He'd been Josephine's ex, the guy she dumped 3 months ago. "Darian, leave." Josephine's voice came next, controlled but shaky, the same tone she used when managing a client's PR disaster. But I could hear it. Her voice cracked just slightly. "I'm not stalking you, Joe. I'm negotiating," Darian continued, the self-righteousness clear in his tone. The words were like a thread, hanging in the air. I wasn't sure what he wanted, but I could tell from his voice it was bad. Josephine wasn't the type to get pushed around, and yet something had her cornered. That's why I heard the next few words that turned the entire situation on its head. "Joe," Darian's voice dropped lower, sharper. "All it takes is one click. The pictures from Cabo, the emails about the merger. I'll upload them to the cloud, set to public, and your firm is finished." I stood up slowly, wiping the thermal paste off my hands with a rag. My heart raced, but I didn't rush. Rushing makes you sloppy. I stepped towards the door, listening closely to the chaotic mix of their voices. They didn't hear me coming. I didn't let them. When I unlocked the door and swung it open, Darian was standing in front of her, phone raised like a weapon. Josephine was pressed against the wall, her coat drenched from the rain, her eyes wide, but fury simmered underneath the surface. She was cornered, and that was something I couldn't let happen. "Phone," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Darian whipped around, confused for a moment, before the smirk slid off his face. "Kieran, the little tech support buddy," he sneered, waving me off. "Go back to your video games." But I didn't move. I stepped into the hallway between them, calm, unflinching. I wasn't here to yell. I was here to protect Josephine. "You're on a private network, Darian," I said, my voice low and controlled. "Unauthorized access is a felony. Attempted extortion is another one." I paused, watching his expression change. "I'm recording the handshake your device just made with my router. It tags your MAC address and GPS location to this timestamp. You know what that means, right?" It was a bluff, but Darian didn't know that. His phone lowered slightly, hesitation flickering across his face. "This doesn't concern you," he spat, looking between me and Josephine. "It does now," I replied, stepping closer. "Walk away, or I send the packet logs to the NYPD Cybercrimes Unit. I know a guy. He loves easy wins." Darian didn't move for a moment, the adrenaline fading, and with it, the facade of power he had clung to. He sneered at me, then looked at Josephine. His posture shifted from aggression to something more calculating, and he finally pocketed the phone. "Check your email, Joe," he said with a venomous grin, clocks ticking. He turned and stormed off toward the elevator, leaving us in the silence that followed. I didn't breathe until the door slid shut and the gear mechanism clicked into place. Only then did I turn to her. Josephine was standing there, trembling slightly, the faintest tremor in her hands. Her armor had cracked, and it made my chest tighten. She had always been untouchable in my eyes, the older, sophisticated woman who I had admired from afar. But right now, she was just a woman caught in a battle she couldn't fight alone. "Kieran," she whispered, her voice shaking as she smoothed her damp coat. "I didn't know you were here. Is Bo home?" Quote. "Bee's out getting beer," I said, my eyes still locked on hers. I watched the exhaustion in her eyes, how the weight of everything was dragging her down. "He's not bluffing, is he?" I asked, my voice soft, almost like I already knew the answer. She shook her head. No, she didn't even need to say it aloud. It was all there in her eyes. I can't tell Beau, she said, her voice breaking slightly. He'd kill him, and then he'd go to jail. The tension between us was thick, charged with something neither of us was ready to name. She turned her phone toward me, showing the email thread Darian had sent her. The subject line read, "Insurance," with a scheduled send timer underneath. The one clean sentence he'd written was a promise of destruction if she involved the police or anyone else. I took a photo of the screen with my phone, then had her forward it to a burner address I controlled. I needed evidence, and I wasn't going to let Darian get away with this. Okay, I said, taking a breath. We do this in the right order. First, we disarm the timer. Then, we walk into a precinct with receipts. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. It was then that I realized she wasn't looking at the guy who had been her little brother's friend. She was looking at the man who had just stepped in front of her and shielded her from the wolf. I promise to keep our secret safe, she whispered, stepping closer to me. Her words settled over me like a promise, and I knew in that moment nothing would ever be the same. 3 days later, Josephine stood in the middle of my living room, wrapped in the silence that only came when we were deep into a job. My loft in Brooklyn wasn't like the sleek glass-walled condo she was used to. It wasn't high-end, it wasn't polished, but it was a fortress. And right now, it was the safest place she could be. It's dark, Josephine said, her voice low, glancing around the dimly lit space. Light is interference, I replied without looking up from my work. The faint hum of the cooling fans and the blinking amber lights of my server racks filled the room. It wasn't just the usual setup for gaming or tech work, it was a high-security operation. And right now, Josephine was the priority. She stood there, looking lost in the space, as if she didn't belong. It wasn't that she didn't belong in this world. It was the vulnerability that showed on her face, the kind she'd always kept hidden behind her polished armor. She wasn't the untouchable woman I'd once admired from afar. She was just Josephine, tired, anxious, and trusting me with more than I ever thought I could handle. Sit down, I said, pulling a chair out for her. We need to triage. She hesitated for a second, then took a seat, her fingers clutching the coffee cup in her hands as though it was the only thing holding her together. She looked at me, waiting for me to tell her what to do. This wasn't a favor anymore. This was an operation. I needed access to everything. Her cloud accounts, her email, her physical devices. If Darian had a backdoor into her life, I needed to find it. I need everything, Joe, I said, my eyes focused on the screen, typing quickly. If Darian has a backdoor, I need to find it. Your devices, your passwords, everything. No exceptions. Josephine's eyes shifted uneasily. I could tell she wasn't thrilled about the idea. After all, I wasn't just someone she used to know casually. I was the guy who used to play Mario Kart in his boxers. I was the guy who could dig through the darkest corners of her digital life, and that wasn't a comfortable thought for someone like her. But she had no choice. We were in this together now. There are photos, she said, her voice tight, personal ones, from when we were together. I stopped typing for a second. I could hear the unease in her voice. I looked at her, but didn't let my gaze linger too long. It wasn't my place to look at what she kept hidden. I'm not looking at the content, I said, focusing on my work again. I'm looking at the metadata. I care about the file paths, the IP addresses, and the last person who accessed them, not what's inside them. It was a lie, but I didn't want to make her feel more exposed than she already did. The truth was, it bothered me more than I was willing to admit. The thought of Darian having those pieces of her, the intimate ones that she had kept for herself, made my stomach churn with anger. But I didn't let it show. I kept my focus on the job. I plugged her phone into my laptop and started cloning it. It was going to take a while. I'll clone the device, I said, glancing at her. It'll take an hour. While it runs, we need to talk about your physical security. Darian came to Beau's. He's tracking your location. We need to figure out how. Josephine's eyes widened and she pulled her phone back, her face pale. I turned off Find My Friends, she said quickly. That's cute, I murmured, watching the progress bar on my screen. But that's probably not enough. Darian's using something more advanced. A passive GPS logger. Or he's cloned your SIM card. Did you ever leave your phone unlocked around him? Her gaze shifted away, staring out the window. We lived together for 6 months, Kieran. He knew my passcode. I kept my fingers moving, isolating the suspicious packets from the phone's network activity. Found it, I said, my voice steady. He's got a mirror app running in the background, disguised as a system update. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. What does that mean? It means he's been seeing your texts in real time, I said, clicking through more data. It's like he's been looking over your shoulder, tracking everything. Her face drained of color, and for a moment I could see how completely trapped she felt. The walls were closing in, and there was no easy way out. But it's good news, Joe, I added, trying to offer a sliver of hope. It means we can feed him false information. We can control what he sees now. He's the one being played. Josephine didn't look convinced, but I could tell she was thinking. Her posture shifted, no longer as fragile as before. There was a quiet strength in her, one that had been buried under layers of stress and fear, but it was starting to surface. You're safe here, I said, my voice gentle. My network is air-gapped. He can't see inside these walls. She nodded, but there was still a quiet tension in the way she stood, the way she held herself. So we're in a bunker? A fortress, I corrected, stepping closer to her, offering her the comfort I wasn't sure she wanted. And we're going to burn his leverage to the ground. The next few days were a blur of endless work, lines of code, and late nights spent hunched over my computer. Josephine was still coming to my loft in the evenings. After the gala planning, after the meetings with her firm. Every night, she'd walk through the door, a little more tired, a little more worn out, but always determined to fight back. It wasn't all work. There were moments, small moments, that felt like we were slipping into a strange kind of normal. I'd be working late, and she'd bring in takeout Thai, sometimes Indian. Things with spice that I always forgot to order for myself. I'd be sitting at my desk running through Darian's network traffic trying to track the source of the threat, and she'd sit across from me, sipping her tea or whiskey depending on her mood. I learned things about her in those quiet moments. I learned that she drank tea when she was stressed and whiskey when she was angry. I learned she hated silence but hated meaningless noise even more. One Tuesday, as I was running a brute force decryption on a zip file I'd found on Darian's cloud, Josephine was pacing behind me, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The silence was heavy, only broken by the clicking of the keyboard. It's taking too long, she muttered, rubbing her temples. The gala is in 10 days. If he releases the photos before the donors sign the checks. He won't, I said without looking up. He's waiting for maximum impact. He's a sadist, not a strategist. He wants you to sweat. Her shoulders tensed, and she rubbed her left temple again, a habit I'd noticed. A headache was coming. I am sweating, Kieran, she said, her voice tight. Her body language was strained, and I could see the toll the whole situation was taking on her. I stood up and walked toward the kitchenette. I grabbed a glass of water and a bottle of ibuprofen from the drawer. I set them on the coaster beside her without saying a word. She blinked at the pills, then back at me, surprised. How did you know? You rub your temple when you get migraines, I said simply, and your left eye squints a little. Josephine stared at me, her gaze lingering a little longer than it should have. It wasn't the kind of look you give someone when you're talking about headaches. There was something deeper in her eyes, a silent understanding, a flicker of something unspoken between us. You notice everything, don't you? She said, her voice quiet. It's the job, I replied, turning away. Patterns, anomalies. I'm an anomaly, she whispered. I stopped, my hands hanging by my sides, caught in the weight of her words. I could feel the distance between us closing, even though we hadn't moved an inch. I didn't know how to respond, but I couldn't leave it at that. Not when everything between us felt like it was about to change. You're the priority, I said before I could stop myself. My voice came out rougher than I intended, and I instantly regretted it. But it was the truth. She was the priority. The silence that followed was heavy. Her breathing hitched slightly, and I could feel the tension in the air shift. I turned back to her, but I didn't know what to say. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but I held back. This wasn't the time. Not while everything was still so fragile. "Kieran," she said softly, breaking the silence, "you've grown up." I let out a quiet breath. "I was always grown up, Joe. You just didn't look down." It was a risky thing to say. I knew it, but it was out before I could stop myself. A challenge, a defiance. And she didn't back away. She held my gaze, searching my face, looking for something. "I'm looking now," she whispered, her voice quiet, but steady. Her hand reached up, hovering near my arm. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted her to touch me. God, I wanted it more than I was willing to admit. But not like this. Not while she was still scared, while she still had the weight of this mess on her shoulders and I was the only one standing between her and the storm. I took a half step back, putting some distance between us, trying to regain control. "Drink the water," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "I found something in Darian's metadata. He's not working alone. He's using a server in New Jersey. We need to get a subpoena request authorized, but we have to do it quietly." Josephine dropped her hand, but the moment shattered. The tension between us didn't go away. It hung there, thick in the air, unresolved. "Right," she said briskly, a change in her tone. It was that professional, no-nonsense voice she used when she was in control. "Show me." I pulled up the data on the screen, explaining what I'd found in Darian's network. We needed to track down this server in New Jersey, but we needed access to his physical location. That meant we had to move. Carefully, quietly. There was no room for mistakes. But even as I explained, I could feel her presence next to me, like a spark just waiting to ignite. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a damp, sticky silence that seemed to settle over everything. I could hear the soft hum of my equipment, the clattering of my keyboard as I tracked down the final pieces of Darian's digital trail. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the task, there was a constant, subtle pull at the back of my mind. Her. Josephine was here again, standing in the doorway of my loft, as if it had become her second home. The world outside was still dark, the rain having given way to a relentless chill that seemed to seep into the bones. She was wrapped in a blanket when she walked in, but it wasn't just the cold she was shielding herself from. It was everything that had happened in the last few weeks. The weight of the scandal, the threat of Darian, and the looming shadow of the gala all hung over her. But still, she was here, every night, a steady presence in my life now. "Late night," she murmured, glancing at my setup. 3 monitors glowing with lines of code, a tangle of wires snaking across the desk. "I work better when it's quiet," I said, not bothering to look away from my screen. She stood for a moment, watching me, then walked over and placed a small bag of takeout on the table. "I got Thai," she said, her voice softer than usual, like she was hesitating. I could tell something was off. Maybe it was the exhaustion I saw under her eyes, the way her shoulders were slightly hunched, or maybe it was just that quiet vulnerability she wore so well now. It was different from the confident, untouchable woman I used to see. This version of Josephine was real, raw, and, in a way, it made her more beautiful than anything I had seen before. "You should eat something," she added, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of my chair as she stepped closer. "You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine," I replied, though I wasn't. I hadn't slept much, not since everything started spiraling, but I didn't need to say that. "You know, we're getting close." Quote. Josephine sat down across from me, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Close to what?" "Getting to Darian," I said, glancing at her for the first time. "He's slipping. I've got his network activity tracked down to a server in Jersey, but there's a physical address I need. We've got to hit him where it hurts. His leverage is online, but if I can find the physical drive he's using to store everything—" I trailed off, my fingers tapping out a rhythm against the desk, frustration creeping in. I knew the clock was ticking. The gala was less than 2 days away, and every minute I spent here, working through the night, was one more chance for Darian to pull the trigger. But she wasn't focused on that. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her face unreadable. "Why are you doing this, Kieran?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting through the tension in the room. "You could walk away from this. You could stay out of it. But you're not. You're helping me, risking everything. Why?" Her question hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't asking about the work. She was asking about me. Why was I doing this for her? Why was I risking my own neck to help someone who wasn't even in my circle? I paused, staring at the screen, my thoughts running wild. The truth was, I didn't know. At first, it had been about protecting her, keeping her safe from the mess Darian was trying to create. But now it was more than that. It was something I wasn't ready to admit, not to her, not to myself. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice quiet, controlled. "This isn't just about keeping your secret safe. It's about you. I stopped myself before I said more. The words were there, hanging on the tip of my tongue, but I didn't know how to say them. It wasn't the time. Not with everything still so messy, so unresolved. "I don't know what you want me to say, Joe," I said instead, taking a breath. "You're not just another job. And this whole situation? It's personal now." Quote. Her gaze softened at that, and for a split second I thought she might say something, acknowledge the shift between us, the quiet understanding we had that wasn't just about computers or servers or threats, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded, the briefest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice low, vulnerable. I didn't have an answer. Instead, I turned back to the screen, knowing that the next step was a risky one. But I had no choice. We didn't have time to waste. The next morning, I was up before dawn, running the final checks. I had traced Darian's physical address to a building in Jersey. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was time to move, time to take this to the next level. Josephine stood beside me, her eyes focused on the screen, her arms folded. She wasn't as confident as usual. Her face was still drawn from lack of sleep, and there was a sense of fear hanging in the air. But she wasn't backing down. "We need to go," I said, locking down the final security on the server. "Once we get the drive, we wipe it clean. No traces, we're done." She nodded, biting her lip, and for a second I saw the woman she had been before. Strong, unshakable. "You've got this," I said, my voice a little softer than I intended. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady now, a small fire lighting in her eyes. "We had one shot at this, and we weren't going to let Darian get away with it." The drive to Jersey was quiet. The city faded into the distance as we drove through the industrial outskirts, the hum of the tires on the wet road filling the silence between us. Josephine sat beside me, her eyes distant, lost in thought, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We were both focused on the same thing, ending this once and for all. The address we had tracked down led to an old building tucked behind a row of warehouses. It was the kind of place that didn't look like much, but it had the kind of security that made you think twice before walking in. But we had no choice. Darian's leverage was here, hidden somewhere in that building. The physical hard drive he'd been using to store everything, every photo, every email, every file that could destroy her career, was our target. I pulled up across the street, cutting the engine, and letting the car idle in the cold air. Josephine's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, her breath misting in the chill as she stared at the building. "Are you ready for this?" I asked, my voice low. She glanced at me, her eyes hard, determined. "We have no choice." I nodded. There wasn't any room for hesitation anymore. The plan was simple. Get in, find the drive, wipe it, and get out. But nothing ever went as planned. We both knew that. We slipped out of the car, moving quickly but quietly, keeping low as we made our way to the side entrance. I had the key card we'd managed to get earlier, and we didn't waste any time. The building was old, but it had been refurbished enough to have decent security. The faint hum of cameras was all we heard as we entered through the back door, using the code I'd gotten off a compromised system in Darian's own network. The hallways were cold, the smell of mildew and old carpet hanging in the air. We moved like shadows, my footsteps quiet, Josephine's almost inaudible as we navigated the corridors, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer we got, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on me. This wasn't just about the job anymore. It wasn't about hacking systems or solving problems. It was about protecting her. We reached the storage room. I checked the cameras one last time, making sure we weren't being watched. I punched in a code, and the door opened with a soft click. Inside, it was just rows of old files and dusty boxes. But I knew what I was looking for. The drive. I scanned the shelves quickly, moving fast, trying not to waste time. Josephine stayed close, her presence a quiet support at my back, even though I knew she had to be terrified. This was Darian's domain, his mess, and we were right in the heart of it. And then I saw it. The drive. It was sitting in a plain black case on a high shelf, just like I had expected. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, slipping it into the bag I'd brought along, already planning the next move. "Got it," I said, glancing at Josephine, who was standing by the door, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Now let's get out of here," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a tension I could feel in my bones. We turned to leave, moving quickly, but that's when it happened. The sudden sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, too close, too fast. I felt a chill go down my spine as I realized what was happening. "Move!" I hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the shadows. We crouched down, pressing ourselves against the cold wall, barely breathing, waiting as the footsteps grew louder. My hand tightened around the drive and the bag, my fingers going numb from the pressure. The footsteps passed, and I let out a quiet breath. We didn't make a sound. The last thing we needed was a confrontation. "Go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're getting out." We moved swiftly, staying close to the walls, following the same path we'd taken in. I kept my focus, always watching the shadows for any sign of danger. But luck was on our side. We reached the door without a sound, slipping back outside into the cold, where our car was waiting. We didn't stop until we were back in the safety of my loft. The drive was securely locked in the safe, and the rest of the operation was set in motion. Darian's reign of terror was over. The files were gone, wiped clean. His leverage had vanished. Josephine sank onto the couch, her exhaustion clear. She didn't look at me right away. It was like she was waiting for the world to catch up, for everything to settle. I sat beside her, not saying anything. We didn't need words. We had crossed a line tonight. We had done something together that none of us would ever forget. The silence stretched between us, heavy but comfortable, until she finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "We did it," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "It's over." I nodded, my throat tight. "It is." She looked down at her hands, the weight of everything finally starting to sink in, the relief, the fear, the realization that the storm had passed. Then, without warning, she reached out and took my hand, her fingers laced with mine, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "I couldn't have done this without you," she whispered, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it before. "You didn't have to," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "You're stronger than you know." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in days, there was something like peace in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Josephine leaned in then, her face inches from mine. I could feel the heat of her breath, the electricity that had been crackling between us for weeks now. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. "Thank you, Kieran," she said, her voice low, before she closed the gap and kissed me. It wasn't just a kiss. It was everything. All the tension, all the years of keeping distance, all the moments that had built up to this. And as we pulled away, I knew it wasn't just about the job anymore. It wasn't about the files or the threats. It was about us. I had kept my promise to her, and now, maybe, she was finally keeping one to me.